Hi, everybody. Dr. L here with another installment. We're just picking up more or less where we had left off with our discussion last time on monopolies and market power. And the topic of this video segment is price discrimination. So sort of as a point of departure from where we had left off in analyzing our perfectly competitive model and our monopoly model, I just wanted to highlight one constraint that we've sort of been operating under, and that's more a consequence of us starting with a reasonable point of comparison between these opposite ends of the market spectrum. Okay, so first note that in perfect competition, because the firm had no influence over the market price, the only choice the firm had was to choose the level of output given that market price. As a consequence, because the firm had no market power, the market price was constant regardless of the quantity produced. Okay, meaning every single unit that the competitive firm sells is sold at the same constant price. Okay. Now, as a point of comparison, we started analyzing a monopoly that does the same thing because we wanted to be able to compare the market outcomes, holding all other factors equal aside from that concentration of bargaining power. Okay, so the same thing is true for the monopolist. In their optimal solution, they produced QM and they charged the same price on all the units. Every single unit was sold at a price of PM. Okay, so the situation where we charge the same price on all of the units that we sell, or essentially the fact that we're treating all the consumers the same in terms of how we price them, we refer to this situation as uniform pricing. Okay, so this is the only case we've considered up until this point, is what happens if either a monopoly or perfect competition, okay, what does the market outcome look like under this uniform pricing strategy? All right, now there may be many situations in real life where uniform pricing describes reality. For example, if you and I both go to McDonald's, we both see the same value menu prices, meaning McDonald's is charging me the same prices that they are charging you. So there are many cases where uniform pricing is the norm. Okay, but you can probably think of cases where firms charge different prices to either different consumers or maybe to the same consumer on different units. But point is, there are probably situations that you can think of where firms are effective at charging different prices on different units that they sell. Big example that comes to mind is airlines. Okay, if you and I are going to the same place, odds are we are paying differently for the same ticket. Because what the airlines do is they try to use a tremendous amount of information to figure out how to personally price me and personally price you. Okay, so moving into this topic of price discrimination, what is it? Price discrimination is the practice of charging different prices for different units sold, which is going to result in really one of the following three situations. Either we have consumers that are being treated differently. Consumer A gets charged a different price than consumer B. Or maybe the same consumer sees different prices as they buy more or fewer units. For example, if you buy one, get one free, the first unit I bought was at full price, but the second unit is free. So that's an example of a firm engaging in a form of price discrimination. Third case could be both. Maybe we're treating people differently, and within each person, they're being treated differently across different units that they purchase. Now, I want to discuss two important conditions that facilitate the ability to engage in price discrimination. Okay, the first condition is known as the ability to prevent resale in the aftermarket, or the ability to prevent arbitrage trades in aftermarket resale. And let me explain a little bit about this. So there's a logistical problem that you may run into if you try to treat two consumers differently. And let me give you a little bit of narrative to explain what I mean. Okay, suppose we go to Starbucks and I'm about to order a latte. I think a latte runs around about $6 now, depending, on the size you choose. So suppose before I order my $6 latte, I see the person in front of me knows the barista, they're friends. And because they know the barista kind of hooks them up. And I see the person in front of me gets charged $1 Meanwhile, it's my turn to pay for the same drink, and the same barista tells me, oh, $6 for me. Okay, aside from the logistical issue of possibly upsetting your consumers from treating them differently, okay, there's another weird incentive that's created if Starbucks was to try to treat us differently in the sense that I just described, and that is I now have an incentive to make friends with the guy in front of me in line. He becomes my buddy. What do? I tell him, hey, if you can get me a latte for $1, I'll pay you that dollar. And if he's very nice, he will do that for me, meaning instead of Starbucks selling one $1 latte and one $6 latte, they only sell two $1 lattes, meaning Starbucks loses out on an additional $5 in profit that they could have made off of me, or $5 in revenue, rather, that I was willing to pay. Okay, so the loser in this situation, where the person who gets the low price can come in, buy it on behalf of the person who would get charged a higher price, this buy low, sell high type situation, is known as an arbitrage trade. If my buddy, my new friend, wasn't very nice, he would recognize, hey, he's saving me $5, and maybe he charges me $5.99 for that drink, recognizing that even saving 1 penny is better off than me paying the full price of $6. However, in that situation, my buddy is the one who captures the profit, or the revenue rather, that should have been going to Starbucks. So if Starbucks could have prevented that aftermarket transaction from happening, him buying it, turning around and selling it to me, then they wouldn't have to worry about losing that profit. So the more the seller can prevent aftermarket resale, the more effective they will be at charging different people different prices. Airlines are extremely effective at doing this because legal restrictions prevent one buyer of an airplane ticket just from giving that and transferring it to another. It's illegal to do that. Okay, the airline is very particular about even how you spell your name on your ticket when you are purchasing it. So there's a legal restraint preventing the aftermarket resale in that market, which is why the airlines can more or less get away with murder and treating consumers differently in how they price them. Okay, just think about the sheer amount of information content that goes into your plane ticket. It's pretty overwhelming. Where you're leaving from, where you're going to, the number of layovers you got, the time you're leaving, the time you're arriving, what class you're sitting in, how many bags you got. You know, the list goes on. That was only 7 pieces of information there. But the list goes on. Maybe they're using your web browsing history. They took cookie data from you, and they're trying to use that to forecast, you know, your willingness to pay based on how many times you've looked at the same flight. So there's a tremendous amount of information that goes into the ticket price that you are charged for your specific plane ticket. And the reason that the airlines can get away with doing that is because they cannot, is because they are able to prevent this aftermarket arbitrage opportunity from manifesting itself. The other condition that makes the airlines super effective at engaging in price discrimination is they have a tremendous amount of data, and that lets them target your willingness to pay, right? The amount you're willing to pay for something, that's generally private information, which you wouldn't want to reveal to a seller. If the seller knows you're willing to pay $10, then they're going to charge you about that much and extract most of your surplus. That's something you got to be careful about. Okay, so if a seller, for whatever reason, has a tremendous amount of information about your willingness to pay, and they can prevent the resale in the aftermarket, they will be generally quite effective at implementing price discrimination. Now, the forms of price discrimination generally fall into 3 categories, one of which is quite theoretical, and we're going to spend a little bit of time with today. The other 2 are more applicable to reality, but are more complicated, and we don't really lose anything with the surface scratch discussion we're going to have regarding 2nd and 3rd degree pricing. So we're going to start off today taking a good hard look at what's known as the 1st degree pricing solution. And this is also known as perfect price discrimination because this considers the case of how a monopolist would behave in the event that they literally had the most information you could possibly have about your consumers. If they had perfect information regarding the willingness to pay of the consumers, meaning not only do I know which consumers are willing to pay a lot and a little, I can tell who is who, but for a given consumer, I know exactly what they're going to pay, not just for 1 unit, but for all of the units that they would potentially purchase. In reality, we don't have that quality of information, but you hire marketing people to improve that quality of information towards the goal that I had just described, being able to extract the full willingness to pay of your customer base. Okay, so if we knew this information, the end result of this is a personalized pricing solution. Every unit, we charge a different price on that unit based on how much the consumer is willing to pay for it. Now, the second form of pricing, which is slightly more complicated mathematically than I think the other two in general, is known as nonlinear pricing. And the idea behind nonlinear pricing is that as the consumer buys more or less, the marginal price they pay on the next unit tends to change. And a consequence of that is the average price they pay changes as they buy more or less. Okay, for example, if you face a discount or if you buy 10 t-shirts, you get the rest at 50% off. That's an example of nonlinear pricing because the price you pay changes as you buy more. As I buy more and more and more, okay, the average price drops because the later units are discounted. Okay, if you go to Disneyland, you pay $100 at the door to go on rides. If you only ride one ride at Disneyland, it's kind of a bad deal. You effectively paid $100 for that ride. But if you ride 10 rides at Disneyland, then all of a sudden each ride only costs you $10 on average. And by the time you've ridden your 100th ride that day, the average price that you paid for each ride is down to $1. Okay, so things like buy one, get one discounts or buy X, get Y discounted, or even an entry fee, like you pay an entry fee at Disneyland to enter, and then you can consume as much as you want once you have access to the market. These are all consistent with this idea of offering some sort of a quantity discount. Okay, and it could easily be the case that you face quantity premium, or maybe the price gets more expensive as you consume more. For example, electricity, utilities, typically you face block pricing schemes like this where once you exceed a certain level of consumption, you get bumped up into a higher tier of marginal pricing. So as you consume more, the good gets more expensive on average. The last type of price discrimination is known as market segmentation. And I want you to think of this as similar to first degree, but we don't have quite as good of information. Okay, so I don't know exactly what every consumer is willing to pay for each unit, but maybe I have some information that at least lets me break up the consumers into groups. Much like what the movie theater does. The movie theater breaks you up into senior citizens, students, general admission. And within each of those groups, they treat everybody the same inside the group. But the idea is each group gets a personalized price. Not each person, but within a group, there is a personalized price attached. Senior citizens get their price. General admissions get their price. Student discounts get their price. So market segmentation, this is more of a divide and conquer type idea. The more information you get about your consumers, the more you can divide them and segment them based on various attributes. And in that limit, if you keep segmenting, you approach more or less perfect price discrimination when the quality of information lets you segment people so granular that you're able to identify their willingness to pay, not just for one unit that they're going to buy, but for any unit that they're going to buy. And so we are going to take a look at the perfect price discrimination case here and think about the implications. In order to do that, I'm going to use a very particular type of technology. So remember the technology we describe by the shape of the cost functions. And for simplicity, I'm going to assume the case here where the marginal cost is just constant and there are no fixed costs, implying that the average cost of production is just going to be equal to the marginal cost of production. Okay, this is fairly consistent with the situation where we had an elastic supply curve or a perfectly elastic supply curve where it was just completely flat. Okay, so if you want to think of it in that regard, we're just dealing with a flat supply curve in this case. All the lessons we're going to go through after this are not sensitive to that assumption that this marginal cost curve is flat. It just makes the analysis a little bit more understandable and we don't lose anything in terms of the lessons. Okay, now, because there's no fixed cost, another added convenience here, or rather an added bonus, is that whenever we talk about producer surplus in this context, since there is no fixed cost, the producer surplus and the profit will be the same thing. Recall in one of the last video segments, we had to differentiate between those two because the producer surplus does not subtract out the fixed cost, whereas profit does. If there is no fixed cost, the two concepts wind up being identical. Okay, now, Looking at this flat marginal cost curve situation, again, we can apply the monopolist profit maximizing rule, where if they're maxing profit, they're going to produce at that allocation where the marginal revenue curve intersects the marginal cost curve. And this corresponds again to the monopolist optimal uniform pricing solution, where they're treating everybody the same. Okay, similarly, on the same diagram, we can identify the perfectly competitive uniform pricing allocation as well. That's the only allocation we could consider because firms didn't have the opportunity to price in that model. They had no market power. And we can also identify the consumer surplus triangle under monopoly, as well as the amount of profit, and in this case, again, with no fixed cost producer surplus that the monopolist extracts. And again, what remains is our usual deadweight loss triangle that represents the shrinkage in the economic pie and the overall market inefficiency resulting from the monopolization of the industry relative to that competitive allocation Q star. All right, now looking at this situation, what we want to think about is it possible for us to do better? And there's really two answers to this question. I would argue there's both a yes and a no. Okay, given that we're constrained to uniform pricing, can we do better? The answer is no. Okay, mathematically, this is the largest that we could draw that green block, given that we're constrained to charge everybody the same price. Okay, if we wanted to go after that consumer surplus, we would have to raise the price, not just on one unit, on all the units under uniform pricing. And we saw a consequence of that was that the marginal revenue curve was steeper than the demand curve. If I wanted to sell a unit, I had to drop the price not just on one unit, but on all of them. Okay, now recall, the monopolist's goal is to maximize profit. And in doing so, really, we want to try to capture as much of the economic pie as possible. Now, note in the allocation that we're looking at here under uniform pricing, it does not look like we've captured the economic pie in its entirety. I see that blue triangle there, and that blue triangle, that consumer surplus, that is evidence that we haven't captured the whole pie. The consumers leave the market with a piece of it. Okay, so that piece of economic pie that the consumers leave with, that's an opportunity for us. That represents a part of the pie that we could have captured, but we didn't. Okay, why didn't we capture it? Well, we were constrained to treat all of the units the same in terms of pricing. In order for us, again, to raise the price to go after that blue region, I'm going to wind up selling fewer units, and as a consequence, that green region gets smaller. So mathematically, if we're constrained to uniform pricing, this is the best we can do. But if I'm not constrained to pricing uniformly, and I can prevent that aftermarket resale, then there's nothing preventing me from raising the price on one consumer without having to sacrifice also raising the price on another consumer. Okay, so what we're going to consider next is we're going to think about how we would price in the event we did know everybody's exact willingness to pay along the demand curve. Okay, so if I'm going to sell the very first unit, note the very first unit, okay, unit number 1 over in this right diagram, the price that a consumer is willing to pay for that unit is all the way up high on the demand curve. So to sell that first unit, I could get away with charging a really high price, provided, again, I can prevent that aftermarket resale and treat people differently. And if I charge a high price, the amount of profit I make on just that unit is this vertical distance. It's the distance between the price I charge and the marginal cost, which in our simplifying assumption here doesn't change. Okay, now if I want to sell a second unit, notice I'm going to have to lower the price a little bit to sell that second unit because the consumer's willingness to pay along the demand curve for the second unit has gone down a little bit. Okay, but I'm willing to charge a slightly lower price as long as that price exceeds the marginal cost. So I'm still making a positive marginal profit on that unit. And we can proceed accordingly. If I want to sell the third unit, I can just charge a different price. So now I'm charging 3 different prices to 3 different consumers on 3 different units maybe. And I'm extracting the full amount of surplus that I possibly can on each of those units sold. And we're going to keep proceeding accordingly. I want to sell a 4th unit, I can lower the price there, and I will capture some additional profit. I can sell a fifth unit, additional profit. Notice every additional unit I sell, I have to kind of cut the price down. But now that we are not uniformly pricing, me lowering the price on a later unit doesn't require me to cut back on prices of the other units. Okay, so I'm lowering the price, capturing that profit. Lowering the price, capturing that profit. And if you look now at how well we're doing, okay, how much profit have we captured? Well, we've captured what was the consumer surplus. We've added that to the monopolist piece of economic pie. So we're absolutely doing better here. Okay, now, can we do even more better? Okay, can we do better than we are in this current situation? The answer is, well, is there another piece of pie for us to get? Okay, and the answer is yes. Okay, we could go after this deadweight loss triangle now. Okay, if we could absorb that deadweight loss, that'd be great. We're adding another piece of economic pie. And we can do that. There's nothing to prevent us from lowering the price further and selling an additional unit and another one and another one. In fact, I'm going to keep selling units as long as the price of what I can sell is larger than the marginal cost of production. Meaning, I'm going to stop selling when the price is equal to the marginal cost of production on that last unit. And that's exactly the trade-off that a competitive firm faced. They priced against marginal costs. So the quantity that the firm would wind up actually selling if they had perfect information and they could charge all these different prices because they can prevent resale is equivalent to the competitive market allocation. Now, if you're looking at this, you may be surprised in that in this solution with perfect information, okay, the monopolist is actually able to extract the entire economic pie. Okay, meaning if efficiency was our concern, this allocation is completely efficient. There is no shrinkage of the economic pie here. So we got rid of that deadweight loss. Okay, so note that the solution to the monopolist optimal pricing problem with perfect information involves the monopolist charging each consumer their max willingness to pay for any unit that they are going to buy. Okay, this again allows the monopolist to extract a full surplus on every unit that they sell, which translates to the monopolist extracting the total surplus in the market here. So the outcome, despite maybe some intuition predicated on the uniform pricing case, does not result in any deadweight loss. It is completely efficient. So an economist concerned with inefficiency wouldn't really have a problem with this. Okay, however, the obvious problem here is that the outcome is definitely not equitable. Okay, the monopolist captures all of the pie. Consumers are left with nothing. So there's a little bit of a normative judgment that we would have to make here if we're going to really suggest that this is good for society or bad for society. If I care about the firms, this is a great thing for the firms to be able to do. But if I'm concerned about the consumer's well-being, this is a horrible thing for consumers. Okay, despite the fact the pie is bigger, okay, the consumers are the losers in this situation, moving from uniform pricing to this first-degree price discriminating personalized pricing solution. Okay. So there's kind of a trade-off between uniform pricing and this particular solution that we're looking at under perfect information and the ability to prevent resale. Okay, and that trade-off is, well, if I uniformly price, the consumers are a little bit better off, but there is deadweight loss. The pie is smaller. Okay, if we move to this first-degree solution, the pie is bigger, but now the consumers do not get any of it. So there's a little bit of an equity efficiency trade-off here that we need to be considerate of. And this trade-off was sort of brought to the forefront of the media recently with respect to price discrimination in the telecoms industry and the relationship to the recently repealed net neutrality rules at the federal level. Okay, so just a little bit of policy application here. In December of 2017, the Federal Communications Commission, under the direction of the newly appointed chairman, Ajit Pai, basically decided to repeal a set of rules known as net neutrality that was imposed a few years prior And these set of rules were extremely popular amongst American voters. In fact, about 83% of Americans that were polled showed overwhelming support for having these rules in place. And what the net neutrality rules did essentially is the following. I'm going to use a little bit of an analogy here. So the broadband providers, they build the infrastructure, the information highway, if you will, that brings the data into your home through the internet. Okay. Now, what net neutrality essentially does is it prevents the broadband companies from creating different lanes on this highway that let data travel faster for certain uses and slower for others. So basically, we have this information freeway, and all the data is able to travel at the speed that it would like. There's no regulation in terms of the broadband companies being able to slow down any particular lane of data. So basically what that implied here is that these rules ensured that the broadband providers had to treat each packet of data uniformly. They couldn't favor, for example, streaming your YouTube cat video faster than, you say, sending a particular email. If they took up the same amount of data, you would get charged the same amount of money since they use the same amount of data. Okay, so the result here essentially of net neutrality is that it forced the broadband providers to treat any packet of data equally, regardless of how that data is being used or regardless of the mode of usage of that data. Okay, however, without net neutrality rules in place after they were repealed, the telecoms providers now have the ability to engage in price discrimination across your different modes of data usage on how you use that data. So imagine the following. Imagine the electric company says, hey, now if you plug your phone into the outlet, we're going to charge you more for that electricity than if you plugged your microwave in and you heated up food and used the exact same amount. That is analogously what the repeal of net neutrality implies that firms are allowed to do in the broadband industry. Providers could literally charge you a different amount of money for using the same quantity of data used to post on Facebook versus using that same data to watch a cat video on YouTube. Okay. And I think a big question that was raised when the chairman of the FCC was pushing through this repeal of a really popular policy is, does it make sense to allow telecoms firms, these broadband firms, that arguably already exert a tremendous amount of market power based on our analysis of thinking about market definition and measuring market power, does it make sense to allow these monopolists to exert even more market power? And if you empathize with consumers, the answer is a pretty fierce no. We probably don't want to do that. It's going to be bad for consumers. However, if you care about the producers, if you have a big heart for these poor broadband monopolists, then we know that allowing them to engage in this type of price discrimination lets them capture more of that economic pie and is absolutely going to accrue a gain towards these sellers. So there are absolutely pros and cons, but they really depend on some normative value judgments here. So Ajit Pai, this is a picture of the FCC chairman here, he made the following argument for repealing the laws. He argued that repealing the laws will allow for a more efficient market outcome when these firms are allowed to engage in price discrimination. And that is absolutely a reasonable argument based off of our analysis of the first degree pricing solution here. Okay, and he argued that this improved efficiency, which translates into higher profits for the firms, will in the future lead to more technological advances as those profits can be reinvested into research and development and future innovation. However, what Mr. Pai completely ignores here is that the efficiency comes at a huge expense, and that is the consumer welfare. Consumers are kind of left in the dirt here, holding no part of the economic pie if these broadband companies are allowed to capture all of it through price discrimination based off of modes of data usage. Another unintended consequence is if I allow a broadband provider to favor certain data uses and not others, then they might not like that I'm using Netflix instead of Hulu when Hulu pays that broadband provider more. And as a consequence, my broadband provider may decide to slow down my Netflix unless I'm willing to pony up a slightly higher fee to utilize that particular mode of data usage to stream video content. Okay, so in response to this repeal, many states have gone ahead against the federal ruling and have implemented their own net neutrality laws in spite of this federal attempt to repeal the rules across the board. So something to think about. We will pick up momentarily, revisiting our discussion of strategy and how that is related to market failure. So I hope you're enjoying the videos, and I will see you soon.